Hey everyone, Mr. Silbaugh here, and this is my recording for day 2 of Module 1, Markup Language and Site Development Essentials. Alright, so in the last class we talked about HTML and kind of the basics of it. We talked about it's a foundation for web design. CSS is a support for HTML by adding design to it. Remember that HTML is the content and structure, and CSS is the fancy stuff that makes it styled. Cloud computing on mobile devices have impacted web design, and text editors and GUIs have many pros and cons, as well as being the main ways that we can write our HTML code. All right, so today's lesson is going to focus on sort of the history of markup languages in HTML, and it's going to take us from the past and bring us to today. Okay, so let's reflect on where we've been. Markup languages have been around for years, and the technology for markup languages goes back until about the 1980s. You don't need to know any dates here. You just need to know the basics of each language, the name of it, and what it does and what it was known for. So first we had what was called Standard Generalized Markup Language, or SGML. It's a meta language, which means that it was used to create other languages. It was made by IBM and made a standard in 1986. What it did was it described documents by organizing concepts separate from their visual presentation. So essentially, it would take the content and concepts of the code and separate it from their visual, like how it would look. It was very difficult to learn and was used to describe the information in a document only. It had zero formatting. The way that it did it was it described how data elements in a document would relate with one another. So if there was stuff in this document, it would describe how they're interrelated and connected. You created your own language rules called document type definition, called a DTD. It's the rules that the document would follow. And so this is one of the reasons why it was so tricky, was because of the fact that you had to create the rules that it was going to follow, okay? There was no set rules, there was no set guidelines. You made everything yourself. It's a fun project if you had the time. Once a DTD was declared, all of the elements in that document would follow and would actually run. So in that last slide, we talked about a few terms. Standard Generalized Markup Language, it was a meta language used to create other languages. It was originally used to describe information in a document, but not the formatting. Meta language is a language used for defining other languages. And document type of definition is a set of rules contained in a simple text file that defines the structure, syntax, and vocabulary as it relates to tags and attributes for corresponding document. So SGML, remember, it's used to describe information in a document, but it has zero formatting. Meta languages are used to create other languages. They're essentially a basis for other languages. And DTD, document type definition, these are rules, and they set what's going to do what. All right, now we're in HTML and kind of before where we are at today. So this was created by Tim Berners-Lee, who was at MIT, very prestigious technical university. It was meant to send nonlinear text. So when we say nonlinear, linear would mean a string, okay? Nonlinear would be, together in a file. We called that hypertext, and it was meant to set hypertext and text across the internet so people could access it from other computers. Berners-Lee thought that SGML was too complex and it did not help with different platforms. It wasn't very user-friendly, is what he was saying. One document links to another with hyperlinks. So when you were writing HTML, you could have one document be connected, and those hyperlinks would bridge them together. These linked documents ended up being the World Wide Web as we know it today. So, what's the difference between them? SGML and HTML allow for data exchange across multiple systems and networks. Both of them allowed for data to be transmitted from one device to another. HTML does not allow you to define the DTD and has fewer language elements. Rules are already established. As we talked about yesterday, I believe that HTML was created and is maintained by the W3C. And in that, those DTDs are already defined by the W3C. They're the ones that keep charge of that. That's why when we start getting into HTML, you'll find out all of the rules that we have to follow and things of that nature. But that's to come. All of that's already been defined for you. You don't have to create your own rules. HTML is very easy to use. That's why we teach it. And it's actually now a standard. HTML5 is not based on SGML, which makes HTML easier. HTML5 is considerably easier than the original HTML versions, which we'll talk about them a little bit, but it's come a long way and it's a lot easier and more user-friendly. So HTML versions, and currently anything done in HTML version 3.1 or lower will not work properly. It will have some issues rendering, but we're not going to worry about 3.1 because the whole course only focuses on HTML5. 3.2 is still functional and some pages still use it. Pages that have been around for a while may actually still use 3.2 or 4.01. And 4.01 was released back in 1999, so we've come a long way. So if you are curious about HTML 4.01, you just need to know some of the things for it. It added CSS. 4.01 was the first edition of CSS. This was the first one that supported multiple spoken languages. So for example, languages like Hebrew who go from right to left, and some Middle Eastern languages that go from right to left. It was the first language to support that and could actually be coded and projected correctly. This allowed for the development of tables, forms, and scripting languages. So 4.01 is where we first started getting our start into modern web design, where we're at now. All right, so 4.01 came in multiple flavors. Interesting term to describe it, but there were different versions of 4.01 when it was released. The first one was 4.01 transitional. This allowed flexibility with CSS or traditional layout instructions. It rendered in browsers that did not support CSS and allowed tags that were less useful. Essentially, this was it's transitional. It was bridging the gap between older versions of HTML and the newer version. 4.01 strict, this only allowed you to use CSS for like design elements. Any less useful tags were not allowed and would not generate and would make some errors if you did use them. 4.01 frame set, this was used for pages with frames that would go around the page and created pages to be placed inside of each other. It made web design more realistic, and it was really the start of like more creative web design. Now, the way that you start your HTML document is this first line, which is the exclamation point doc type. This is required, and it allows you to start your document and say, hey, I'm going to make a web page. You must include it, and we'll talk about this more in Unit 2, I believe. All right, so this is the timeline of HTML. I'm not really going to go over this too much because we're here now in 2017. Not really, we're in 2020, obviously, but in 2017, this is the version where we're at now is 5.2. However, HTML really didn't get started until about 1989, and 1991 was when the first version of HTML was released, created. So we've come a long way, and this is the official steps. So you can pause this video if you want and take a look, but you're not really going to be tested on it. All right, so XML. Let's talk about this. XML, also called Extensible Markup Language, describes data elements on a page. It enhances structure and navigation of data. HTML is content and structure. XML is data on the page. It describes the data that's on it. Doesn't make any page appearance or change any of that. And businesses like XML since it allows data to be exchanged. The main focus of XML is data going back and forth. And one of the things is XML is used primarily with intranets and extranets since they're more secure. XML is really contained within certain businesses and organizations, and they like it more because it's very secure. XML can be formatted into print documents, web documents, PDF files, Braille, text-to-speech, and more. So for example, the data that's contained in a book could be published to the web because the data and information is contained within this file. It's only used for data, so any changes that happen will happen instantaneously. XML is misunderstood. It might be thought that XML is another markup language used only for web pages, but it's not used to format them. It's only used to describe the data. You don't need to know any XML. You just need to know that it is used for data description and know the difference between XML, HTML, and then soon to be discussed, XHTML. XML is a markup language that describes document content instead of adding structure or formatting to the document content. All right, we had HTML, then we developed XML, and now we have XHTML, which is extensible hypertext markup language. They are drastically different, as we've noticed. HTML is used for content and structure. XML is used for data description of a web page. So there was they wanted to find a way to bridge them together so you could have both. The original idea was to transition from HTML to XML without making any existing web pages unusable, but that ended up not working, so they kind of created a middle road to bridge the gap. It's not meant to generate correctly, but can and will without a problem. All right, so there are multiple versions of XHTML. When it was first created, we had 1.0 and 1.1 created. 1.0 was made in 2000 and recommended by the W3C. And 1.1 was added in 2001, so they're only a year apart from each other. 2.0 was going to be developed, but then we ended up coming up with XHTML5, and XHTML5 is currently under development. So as we said, HTML describes the visual layout, and XML describes the function and context. XHTML allows HTML to become available for use with XML. Remember, we're bridging the gap so that HTML and XML work together in harmony. XHTML allows HTML, extends it by allowing documents to have a visual layout while also having a description. When we're saying description, we're talking about the data and the information that's contained within that document. It's used to describe. All right, so in Schoology, you're going to have Lab 1.1. The instructions here on this are incorrect. I have the correct version posted in Schoology. This slide was from the old original lesson I taught last year, so just ignore this, but you're going to do a little bit of a scavenger hunt today. Mostly I want you to reflect on what you learned, okay? That's going to do it for this lesson.